Good morning. It's Friday, Rochester today, heading into a summer-like weekend in late October. I'm Andy Brownell on News Talk 1340, KROC AM and 96.9 FM. It's time to check in with the MedCityMovieGuy.com. It's Chris Miksanic. Hi, Chris.
Hey, how you doing?
Doing great. Good to hear from you.
Yes, it is, I'm sure. Anyway, so there's that. So there's a lot going on. You know, you talked about late October, and one of the things that happens in late October is Halloween, and we'll get to some Halloween films, I think, at the end. But yeah, this is a crazy time for weather. I think it was a little cool. It's supposed to get warm, you know, as far as the kids go, and I still have my 10-year-old little boy mentality. I just hope it's warm enough that I don't have to wear a winter coat over my Superman costume, or I think it was Daniel Boone that I wore it with, and everybody's like, what are you supposed to be? I guess Daniel Boone in Washington. Didn't he go to Washington? No, that's David Crockett was in Washington. He was a
correct
politician, something like that. So, but
Daniel,
you know, when
Boone was in the Appalachia and fighting.
Yeah. But it was still cold in the Appalachians, I'm sure. So,
do you remember back in the day when you
Daniel
went out?
Boone, that's way before my time.
No, I mean when you did have the bad luck and it was cold on Halloween, and back when the parkas were all the rage.
Oh yeah.
So you got stuffed into this big parka with this hood with fur around the edge of it.
Right.
Yeah. You might as well. Everybody's an Antarctic explorer this year.
I was just going to say, that's exactly what I was going to say. In fact, one of the first years when we moved up to Rochester, it was freezing. And I think we relegated ourselves to just trick-or-treating at the Apache Mall. They had each of the stores that had tons of kids there. It was just, it was freezing. No, I definitely remember that. In fact, I remember more often in the Midwest than not it being cold for Halloween. So you're right. I mean, you might as well have dressed up as Admiral Byrd, for your costume, because you weren't going as a Samoan that year. That's for sure. Because it was pretty bad.
Truth be told, Halloween is almost a national holiday at my household.
Yeah.
For my better half, she goes to the extreme for Halloween. We actually, you have to see it to believe it. I could probably fund my retirement on the amount of inflatables that she has purchased for the yard.
Oh yeah, well that's fun. It's fun when the neighbor does it. Because I remember when we were shopping for houses and somebody says, "Well, this one has curb appeal." I said, "Well, then we should buy the house across the street and we can look at this one all the time." Because and so that's the great thing when the neighbors or the neighborhood does that sort of thing. I remember a friend of mine had an incredible, like the basement was a total haunted house thing, and somebody, let's just say, had a lot of fun doing it. And it almost seems like every TV show, people go overboard for Halloween. Nobody's just has a bucket of candy at the door. They're all crazy for Halloween. So it's fun that some people are still doing it, because Halloween's a fun time. And I was going to save this for the end of the segment, but because we're talking about Halloween, let me tell you about 5 of what I think are the best Halloween films. And by scary and creepy, I don't mean slasher films. I was never a huge fan of that. To me, it's like blue humor. It's cheap laughs. You'll get the laugh, but it's not. There's not like a takeaway where you say that was a great movie, or for 2 hours I was on the edge of my seat. You don't say that for a lot of those movies. You might have been, but it doesn't seem to have the good aftertaste. So one of my favorites, and these are all going to be about the same era, because I'm sort of in my mind, I'm 12 years old, staying up at night watching creature features. So one of my favorites, because I remember this was just an amazing movie, was Tales from the Crypt. I don't know if you've ever seen that one, but in those days you had Peter Cushing was in one of the segments. Joan Collins was stalked by a maniacal Santa Claus, and I think there were 5 segments, and each one of them was just It was like the magazine, the creepy magazine. You used to see like mixed in with comic books at the magazine.
Oh, I remember
stands when you're a kid. Yeah, creepy and stuff like that. So Tales from the Crypt is one that I like. And again, it's very 70s. So it's not a sophisticated film by today's standards. I think people probably demand more today, but I still think it was organic enough to really rattle you a little bit. Of all the now a basic Universal monsters kind of guy, so Bela Lugosi, Karloff, Lon Chaney Jr., all that sort of thing. You had me at hello, because I love those movies, The Mummy and all that, the original stuff. But I think of all of the Dracula movies, one of the ones that creeped me out the most was it wasn't a Universal movie, it was a Hammer film. It was called Horror of Dracula, and this is one of the ones with Christopher Lee as Dracula, and there's a couple others. Dracula has risen from the grave and all that kind of stuff, but Horror of Dracula was the basic Dracula story, and I don't think anybody in this case did it as foreboding as did Christopher Lee. So that's Hammer Films 1958. So that's worth seeing. One that I liked because it has a sustained thrill behind it. It's called The Glass House. Now, that may sound familiar. It's basically these two kids who are orphaned and taken in by a friend of the family. And I don't want to give away the premise beyond that, but it stars Lily Sobieski, and Bruce Dern is in it as well. Brother and sister, as I said, taken in by a friend of the family, and I'll leave it at that. But there's a real sustained. It's a more recent film. It's from the 2000s, so there's sort of a certain hip vibe to it that I like a lot. Of the more contemporary movies too, I think Poltergeist has really held up well. They're here. That's
right.
Spielberg.
I love that film.
Yeah, Spielberg film, and I remember seeing it when it first came out. I mean, I just remember this is a film unlike anything I had seen up to that time. A real smart kind of thriller. It didn't have a lot of blood in it or anything like that.
And it had humor to it as well.
It did. Well, it had a very natural, organic humor to it. The kind of humor that does occur in everyday life. So it wasn't, by no means it was a comedy, but it was light enough that that was really kind of what took you in, because it seemed like a light, cool movie, and then things start happening. So
was that Drew Barrymore?
No.
Okay.
That little girl, she had died. Remember, she died a few years later.
Oh no.
I forget her name. She had like some kind of sepsis or something. Yeah, I forget the actress's name, but she passed away. And then the older, this is a horrible story. It was almost like a curse at the movie. And then the older sister, who I think only had one or two lines in the whole movie, she had died as well. She had some kind of domestic violence or something like that. Also a few years later. But no, the little girl was not Drew Barrymore. Drew Barrymore was in a parallel film to Poltergeist. E.T. came out, I think, within a year of it. And
okay. There's my confusion.
Yeah. So Poltergeist was Craig T. Nelson and Joe Beth Williams. And I think if I got to say, my scariest thing is when that clown under the bed. They like the clown. It was like a clown. What do you call it? I guess stuffed toy or something like that. That was sitting in the chair, freaking the kid out, and then
that would freak me out. That's the stuff of nightmares.
Yeah, it is. It is. And then probably my favorite of all of them is, and I don't know why. My son a couple of years ago said he thinks he knows why, because this is me, right, in this movie. It's called A Lady in White. It's a movie from 1988, and Lucas Haas plays a 9-year-old who gets locked in his grade school's cloakroom and kind of encounters this ghost of a little girl who was killed there a few years earlier. And the film has a really, like, I guess, late 50s, I guess early 60s vibe to it. But it's just this little boy in this, Dracula mask, and he finds himself at the sort of vortex of this. Have you seen it? Because I have not. Yeah. It has like a real reminiscent, I guess, feel of like the Wonder Years. It's like if the Wonder Years was a thriller, that would be this movie.
And I think The Lady in White?
The Lady in White, 1988, Lucas Haas. And I think it's one of the creepiest films ever made because there's such an undertone to it. It's creepy because of the uncle. And again, I don't want to go in, I don't want to make it the spoilers, but it's creepy because of both the natural and the supernatural. And it's, I don't know. And again, maybe I'm the only one who thinks this is one of the best films because, like I said, I feel like this character is me because that was me at 9, dressing up and watching the monster movies and stuff like that. So anyway, I like it. So that was it. So that was the last of the 5, the Lady in White.
The one that comes to mind for me, and this is it's off in left field. I believe it was called The Return of the Night of the Living Dead. I know there were multiple Nights of the Living Dead, after the original classic, but this one was based upon an accident at a nuclear power plant and the impact it had. And, it's awful, but it's Night of the Living Dead, but it was also one of the funniest movies I have ever seen. It was laugh out loud funny, some of the lines in this movie. And I don't mean campy either. It was intentionally funny.
I would say one that fills that criteria that I didn't put on the list because, again, it's the natural as opposed to supernatural, is a movie called Tucker and Dale vs. Evil. Have you ever heard of this movie?
I have, but I've never seen it.
Okay. This is, I guess they'd call it a black comedy, but it's a comedy horror film. And this is one of the wildest, most off-the-wall films. It's just a bunch of it's a bunch of kids go out in like the forest or whatever, and they encounter these 2, I guess, kind of hillbilly characters. And it is such an incredible amount of sort of misinterpreting things that go on between them that rises to sort of, I wouldn't quite call it a slasher film. So there is a lot of, gruesomeness in it, but it is like one of the wildest, funniest things you've ever seen. I mean, so definitely, it didn't make my list of 5. But I think if I had a list of 10, it would probably be there. Tucker and Dale vs. Evil.
Okay. I wrote it down. We have to take a break, Chris. We'll be back just a few moments with more of the MidCityMovieGuide.com. It's Rochester Today. News Talk 1340, KROC AM and 96.9.
Paul Frobley.
Welcome back. Rochester Today, Friday with Chris Miksanic, the MidCityMovieGuide.com. Our monthly check-in about all things movies on News Talk 1340, KROC AM and 96.9 FM. Well, Chris, we covered Halloween.
Right. So I was born in the middle class, and I'm sorry. I thought that's kind of the response to anything that we don't have an answer for. So anyway, one of the films I want to talk about, this is one that I've been looking forward to. And this is the problem with expectations. I always say that, it's unfair when people rate a movie based on whether it met, exceeded, or didn't meet your expectations. Because, I might have higher expectations from Spielberg than I do from some unknown. And if Spielberg meets them, but the unknown exceeds them, is that like the same rating? And I don't know. In my head, it makes more sense in my head than what I just said, but
no, I get what you're saying.
So the film I wanted to talk about for a little bit now is called Saturday Night. So I had a lot of hopes for it because it talks about the origin of the TV show, what we know now as Saturday Night Live.
Oh,
okay. And I thought, I think there was some talk earlier in the year because Bill Murray had some comments. Of course, he's not in it because this only talked about the premiere episode. But he brought in some comments about who he'd like to see play him, and I'm not sure who he said, but it was pretty funny. It could have been like Denzel or something, but it didn't matter. He said it didn't matter because I'm not in it, and I think it would have been interesting. But as it is, the film's called Saturday Night, and it's well, it didn't meet my expectations. Let's say it's not the film I would have made. It basically what it is. It's sort of like the chaotic 2 hours before the first live airing in October of '75. That gives you a sense of how long that show's been on. And if you remember when the show was on, it's like, wow, now I feel a lot older than I did before. But I think the problem in my mind with the film is it doesn't really explore the so-called not ready for primetime players, Belushi, Aykroyd, Gilda Radner, Lorraine Newman, who am I leaving out? Garrett Morris.
Yep.
Yeah, and Chevy Chase, of course. It doesn't really explore how they all kind of fell together in this cast. They're just kind of there. They don't have any backstories. It really is just more about the behind the scenes, Lorne Michaels trying to get the show going, and the executives hoping he fails, and this and that and the other thing, and Milton Berle's filming something in another studio in Rockefeller Center, and I really don't know if that was true, because it would have been like 11:30 at night. I think Berle would have been sleeping, but anyway, because he was up there in years. So as I said, it's the film itself represents probably the same kind of chaos as they're trying to depict with the TV series. We do get some glimpses of some characters, and you have to kind of bring in your own fill in the blank backstory. So, we see Andy Kaufman, who's a personal, I was going to say personal friend of mine. No, he's not. He's a personal favorite of mine. I was always, I don't know, enamored, I suppose is one word. I just was fascinated by Andy Kaufman. He was funny just because I don't think he was always trying to be. He was just trying to be entertaining and trying to get a reaction from the audience. So we see a little bit of Andy Kaufman, who was kind of a big deal at that point. I mean, it was in the mid and late 70s where he really
So when does Taxi, because I mean that's because Kaufman played the eclectic taxi driver, right?
So he played Latka, right?
Yeah, Latka. That was about the same time, wasn't it?
Yeah, I suppose it was. About the same time. I don't have the Taxi timeline, but yeah, I know that was in the later 70s. But no, Andy Kaufman was a big deal. There's no doubt, and he was very funny. And I don't think anybody could do better than Jim Carrey did in the movie Man on the Moon. That was the story of Kaufman's life, because I remember watching Kaufman with my brother, the Mike Douglas show and the Tonight Show, and he just never failed to just.
Oh, he was a lunatic.
He was wild, but I don't know what the word was. I mean, he was, because he himself would say, "I'm not a comedian, I'm an entertainer," and he was that. He was entertaining. There was, I got to tell you, if you really want to see Andy Kaufman at his best, you have to see, there's some clips on the internet of like when he was on the Dick Van Dyke variety show. And it's funny. It's just funny. Anyway, so Kaufman's there, and he's doing the shtick with the radio, the Mighty Mouse theme. Have you not seen that bit before?
Oh yeah. No, I remember. I mean, I don't go back and watch those, but I watched the first show. I remember seeing that. I was in junior high school.
Yeah. And, at first, I don't think at first a lot of us really thought that was particularly creative. But, when you look back on it and you think to yourself, because I get this, from the award shows and meeting or not meeting celebrities for this reason, is that their lives are so carefully curated down to the minutes. When I hear him talking about putting the Critics' Choice show together, it's like, well, so we got 3 minutes here, 4 minutes there. It's like we can't spare a 1 minute slot for this. I mean, so carefully curated. And here's a guy who's going to stand up for a 3-minute sketch, and he just stands there and he waits to say, here I come to save the day. I mean, it's like a one joke premise, and it's bold, right? I mean, nobody would do that today.
So maybe that's the description of Kaufman you're looking for, bold.
Yeah, I suppose. But as I was talking to you about, one of the funniest things is that he's on the Dick Van Dyke show, and there's another guy, and they're competing for the Fonzie look-alike contest. And the guy who beats him is like, it was like a black guy, and he's like, this guy doesn't even look like Fonzie. But then again, neither does Andy Kaufman. So the whole premise, it's hysterical. And Dick Van Dyke plays the best straight man in this routine. We think about Dick Van Dyke's show, but this is his variety show, 10, 15 years later. It's hysterical. Their Belushi, because Belushi's kind of the breakout character. Their Belushi, I think, is too much, tries to mimic Jack Black, and I think he's too deep. He's apparently formally trained and all this stuff, and all this is beneath him. That's what they tell us, right? Very, very thinly. But there's no backstory. The show the movie just kind of opens with him being temperamental in his, in his dressing room and not signing his contract and all that. And Dan Aykroyd's kind of flittering around in the background, the Chevy Chase character as well. And again, there's a lot of concern about the affiliates and executive and things like that, and really not enough about the origin of the show. I mean, we do have a Jim Henson character who they make out to be very flaky. And, it's worth mentioning that probably one of the best documentaries of the year is also about Jim Henson. So if you get a chance to see it, Henson is an amazing career, an amazing. I'm sorry.
No, you mentioned that I think it was a few months ago we talked about that one.
We did talk about it, yeah. And so amazing career. He was very protective of the image of the Muppets. By no means was he, I don't know. He wasn't. He wasn't like a puritanical about him. He really, one of the reasons, in fact, he started the Muppet Show and some other things was because he felt too too constrained by Sesame Street. After a year, he's like, he really wanted to do, not necessarily adult content, but content that reached more than just little kids. So, I mean, we do learn, we know more about Henson after the documentary than Jason Reitman does in this film. George Carlin's in the background, of course, because he was the first host. Billy Preston, first musical act with Janis Ian. I was never a big Janis Ian fan, but I know a lot of people are. But Preston was touring with the Stones at the time. So, I mean, these were top names, right? And then the other thing I think we learned is that, one of the whole reasons that SNL was launched was to give the network some leverage in negotiating with Johnny Carson. So it was almost like they'd be okay if it failed. They just wanted to get Johnny back to the negotiation table. I think they were talking about running some reruns of The Tonight Show on Saturday night or something. And
see, I did not know that part of it.
I know, but see, neither do I think it was necessarily important, in the movie. I mean, that's obviously.
No, I'm more concerned about the primetime players. I want to know more about what they were like coming into this, because they were already becoming known, but this vaulted them all into superstardom very, very quickly.
Exactly. I mean, somebody went out and they scouted the comedy troops and this and that, and they put this team together, and there had to be some sort of natural synthesis that they all work together. You do get a little bit about Garrett Morris wondering, why am I here? Is it just like a token racial quota or what? And he didn't seem happy, and maybe he wasn't. I don't know. That part may be true. I just don't think they did enough to service the cast.
Oh, yeah.
But one of the things I wanted to point out was there was, and you I'm sure you'll remember this, there was a knockoff of Saturday Night called Fridays. Do you remember Fridays?
I do. I remember that.
And Fridays, by the way, it didn't age well. You can watch it on the Roku channel. I saw a few episodes, including the pilot, where they claim they are not a Saturday Night knockoff. And then, of course, the most famous episode is the one with Andy Kaufman, where he starts a fight on set because he didn't want to do the material. I don't know. You probably heard about that. They frame that in the movie Man on the Moon. So that's available.
All right. You know what? We have to take a break for news. It is that time. We'll have to return in just a few minutes with the MedCityMovieGuide.com. It's Chris Miksanic. I'm Andy Brownell. Rochester Today, News Talk 1340, KROC AM and 96.9 FM.
9 FM.
Good morning. Welcome back. Rochester Today, Friday morning with the MedCityMovieGuide.com. Chris Miksanic here at News Talk 1340, KROC AM and 96.9 FM. I'm Andy Brownell. And right before the break, you were talking about this new film, about the first episode of Saturday Night Live and your disappointment in it. And I was thinking about how wonderful that miniseries was about the making of Godfather.
Right, The Offer. It was called The Offer.
Yeah. And that one was done right.
Yeah, it was, because they explored the backstory of assembling the cast and the production issues. And as I said, this one this is just not the film I would have made, and that's fine. Nobody asked me, right? But I still think it was fertile ground, and maybe there'll be another one coming up. Maybe they'll pick a season with Bill Murray when he came on. I know, so when Chevy Chase came on, maybe there's some more story there. But one of the offshoots of that, and I didn't want to spend too much time on this, but there were, I think the offshoot of this, there's about 10 or 12 films that were made based on skits of Saturday Night Live. I was just wondering, can you think of any of them that were films?
Off the top of my head, no.
Well, I mean, the number one, first, most popular, it was the first one out, and the most profitable one was the Blues Brothers. That was
oh my gosh, yeah.
Yeah. So they were Belushi and Aykroyd created those characters, the Blues Brothers.
I've got I've got cop tires. I've got.
I know. And it was the model created before catalytic converters, so it runs good on regular fuel. Yeah. No, that was an amazing movie. And then the only other one that did really well was Wayne's World. There's a Wayne's World movie and Mike Myers,
multiple Wayne's World movies.
Yeah, there were a couple. Then there were some really. The rest of things being flops. The Coneheads, which was a fun premise, didn't do well in a film. It's Pat, the Julia Sweeney character, Pat. A Night at the Roxbury, which is with Chris Kattan and Will Ferrell. That was horrible. Superstar was the Molly Shannon's Mary Catherine Gallagher's. There was a lady.
Horrible, but it wasn't great.
No, it was not. It was bad. Sorry, I'm gonna overrule that. There was a Ladies Man movie, the Tim Meadows character, Ladies Man. But what I think is probably one of the worst of all of the films was the MacGruber. I don't know why I hated this movie. What I wrote in my review in the Post Bulletin, let me read this to you. If you've ever seen someone walking a dog and wondered what was in that plastic supermarket bag they dutifully carried behind, I'm pretty sure it was the script for this movie. That's what I said. And a lot of times you come back and you go, man, maybe I was kind of hard on this movie, or I would have said, no, that pretty much summed it up. I did not like that one. So a lot of these things that they didn't translate, but.
See, in your role as a movie critic, I would say that would be one of the negatives, that you felt obligated to actually watch that film.
Well, so, that's always the joke. I see the stuff so you don't have to. But the great thing is a lot of these times I do have a choice. So, I mean, between last time and say this time I was talking to you, there's some stuff out there. I'm like, I don't really care about that. And, I've seen enough of it in promotional materials or segments. And I don't think I'd want to talk about it either. So I do a little bit better now, but you're right.
Okay.
And
because I'm thinking MacGruber, it was tough to make a 5-minute skit out of that premise. To make an hour-and-a-half movie would have been.
Exactly. And I'd actually have to go back to 2010 and look at what else was coming out that week to tell you why I decided to review that one and not something else.
It was a bad week.
It was a bad week. Anyway, one of the things that was good about this week is I want to talk about one of the documentaries. But before that, the nominations for documentaries was announced earlier this week. And a couple of the films that we've talked about in the past, The Greatest Night in Pop, that's the We Are the World documentary, and the Jim Henson Idea Man documentary that I talked about. Those are two of the things that were nominated. So I hope they do pretty well in the overall voting, because I think those are probably two of the best ones. There's a short that I'm not going to talk about a lot, but just to mention it, it's called The Incident. And it's a New Yorker short. I think it's like 20, 25 minutes. And it's just, believe this or not, it's just like CCTV and police cam video of a police shooting that happened. I think it was in Chicago. It doesn't really matter where it was, but it was just the notion was, they encounter somebody on the street, want to check the guy for whatever, and things escalate like in the blink of an eye. So when people say things like, well, cops should do this better, you know what? When you have a fraction of a second to make a decision, that's a luxury you don't have. I mean, they should be better trained. You can't train for that. I mean, that's just, some of these things are natural responses.
Well, the one I like is I always hear, well, why didn't they just shoot him in the leg? Are you kidding?
Yeah, I saw that John Wayne did that in a movie. Shot the gun right out of his hand. Yeah, I know. It's ridiculous. This is how ignorant people are. We should be embarrassed that people make those suggestions. That how if they knew how ridiculous they sounded. That's all I could say. Is that just not what you do? And you don't shoot somebody like once, like in a movie. Because they keep coming. I mean,
And there's also this thing called adrenaline.
As I said, you move into sort of a reaction mode. Yeah. So if you're going to say ifs or why didn't they, I would start by saying, well, why did you maybe not decide to steal the car in the first place? I mean, there's enough blame to go around, right? So it all starts with a felony to begin with. But anyway, I don't even know why we're off. So the incident is the film, and it's mostly like chit chat between a lot of these cops who have their body cams on after it happens about, well, don't. Make sure they don't talk to so-and-so and just keep your mouth shut until the investigation. And, I'm not saying there's a corruption involved. I'm just saying that's their procedures then kicking in. And
right, because that would taint the investigation.
Right. It's a fascinating 20 or 25 minutes is what it is.
Okay.
That's all I can say. But what I think is probably, I got to tell you, this one came out of left field for me because I hadn't even heard of this. I think this is one of my favorite documentaries of the year. It's called Yacht Rock. Have you heard of this? Yacht Rock? No. Yacht Rock, like the boat, the yacht. This movie, the documentary is actually called Yacht Rock, a doc, like DOCK, like, where boats go, a documentary. That don't let that don't let that dad joke in there. But there's this phenomena that I had never even heard of, but apparently it's sort of a web kind of culture thing that I don't know, somebody has a web show or something called Yacht Rock, and I guess it's somewhere from the mid 70s to early 80s. This music 1976 to 1984 is what they define as the yacht rock era. It's kind of like a soft rock kind of thing. And at first,
like Pablo Cruz.
Well, it's funny you mentioned Pablo Cruz because yes, like Pablo Cruz, but what's amazing is they pull this together in such an impressive way that that's what I thought when it started. The first maybe third of the movie, I'm like, I'm not liking this because are you mocking the music that I grew up with or whatever? Because I just I talk a lot about whether this captures the vibe of something, because if you were there, you're in a unique position to say there's this documentary which is going to immortalize something, but does this convey what it was really like? Because I worry that in the future, just because I sat in these classes where the teacher was, I don't know, maybe hungover that day, and they said we're going to just watch this video on this 1942 something or other. So I worry that is this information that they're relying on, is this accurately capture something? And so I get a little protective of the era that I grew up in. So this one I did think captured the vibe, as opposed to when I talk about the disco sucks movement, how I went on such a pedestal, how it is nothing, there's nothing racist about it. We were just pushing back against the Bee Gees and the leisure suit culture. Okay, so this is why I think this is important. Anywhere, what I say, somebody somewhere coined the phrase yacht rock, and it's the West Coast sound, adult-oriented soft rock, things like that. But it's much more than that. It's much more, I guess, after about a third of the film, you really sense what they're doing here. And if you remember, one of the best documentaries from a couple of years ago was called Echo in the Canyon.
Oh, my gosh, yeah.
Yeah, where they talk about...
Dylan's son was the narrator.
Right, that's the one. So you talk about all the characters, the Jackson Browne, all these people who kind of lived in that neighborhood, and they all sort of infused each other's music, and they created like an incubation here. So what yacht rock is, it's sort of the same thing, but maybe 10, 15 years later, and again, it's all the same people. So it's Toto. You remember the band Toto who did...
I was a big Toto fan.
Hold a Line, Rosanna, and of course Africa. It's Steely Dan. It's all of these people, and they say it starts with Michael McDonald.
Oh, really? From the Doobie Brothers.
Well, he came in later in the Doobie Brothers, and then he appeared in just about everything after that, including, for example, if you remember Christopher Cross when he did Ride Like the Wind. Michael McDonald comes in, I got a long way to go. right. So the character. So they become these very distinctive voices and musical styles appearing on all of these things. I mentioned Toto. Steely Dan was a really big thing. Steely Dan's album called Asia. They talk about that having the distinct honor of being the album that stereo salesmen used to demo speakers in the hi-fi shops.
Right? That rings absolutely true.
Yeah. So that's kind of fun to see the same people. And then they say that the period is kind of punctuated. Again, on the one side, it's 76, and then on the other side, probably they say Michael Jackson. Probably once Michael Jackson's star ascended, that changed the face of the music scene.
83, 84, somewhere around
80. There. Well, they named it as 84. And interestingly enough, a lot of the same people, Toto, they call them the Toto guys. They
were all studio musicians, the Toto people.
They were, and they appeared on. In fact, I think one of them wrote Michael Jackson's "Human Nature," which was, I think, on the Thriller album, and so they performed on it and did some writing. Boz Scaggs is another name that comes up in this era. Dire Straits, yeah.
I'm just completely sold. I cannot believe you've been. I gotta see this movie right now.
Well, it doesn't drop.
I'm not being facetious either.
It drops next month, but I think you'll find it fascinating. It's going to be on HBO, and you'll be like, "Wow, this is Echo in the Canyon, but for the era I grew up in."
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and that part is really fun. I think it's really fun. And then you find out there's a couple little nuggets of things that you find fascinating, like Christopher Cross, who we think of as one of the most soft rock, smooth music players. He substituted for Richie Blackmore in the band Deep Purple.
No kidding.
Yeah, and they said, I think Blackmore, I don't know if he had a flu or something, and so he sat in with Deep Purple, and they said, nobody, they've had guests before, but they had never had a substitution before. Wow. And he subbed for Richie Blackmore and Deep Purple. So that's pretty amazing.
So Deep Purple is almost like the soundtrack of my younger days, because my older brother still is a Deep Purple fanatic, and so he is 5 years older than myself, so he was buying albums before we were, and cassettes. And so if mom and dad were out of the house and they had the hi-fi set, he would crank out Smoke on the Water until our heads were about ready to explode. That's interesting.
I think so, and I think so. It's a neat film, because, as I said, when you first see it described, I was very dismissive of it. I said, I gotta screen these things, right, for the documentary awards. And then I was like, actually at first, like I said, I was a little bit, are you disrespecting the music that I sing along to? Yeah. And then I was like, no, this is somebody who does embrace it at a level deeper than I ever had. So that was pretty neat. I like
that you don't have to get on your soapbox and defend yacht rock.
Yacht rock. That's right.
I like that. I do like that. Okay. We've got about 3-4 minutes left to, what do you want to cover?
Okay. So, there was another film that I wanted to talk about. It's coming up. It is it's a silent movie. It's the 100th anniversary. And you remember when you said just now that this was the soundtrack of your life. So early next year, there's a Buster Keaton movie called Sherlock Jr. That's going to be 100 years old next year. So I guess that makes, or 101 next year. I guess that makes it 100 this year. And what they're doing, and you'll relate to this, is REM, the band REM, Michael Stipe, and we talked about Man on the Moon a little earlier.
Absolutely.
They're pairing it. They're pairing the showing of this with REM's Monster and New Adventures in Hi-Fi. And the first thing that came to my mind,
Wizard of Oz.
That's exactly what it was. That some people might remember that if you start Dark Side of the Moon, I think
done it.
When Dorothy opens the door or something like that, that it apparently plays really well. I always wonder, is that a conspiracy theory or did that really happen? I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, somehow David Gilmour and the bunch got together and said, hey, let's make this best-selling album of all time coincide with The Wizard of Oz.
Yeah. So
it seems plausible when I say it, actually.
Well, but would that be the movie you'd pick? I don't know, maybe. I mean, Dark Side of the Moon is a pretty amazing album. I think that really got me to really love headphones, Well, two reasons. I could never turn the music up. My mom's turn it down, turn it down. And so I had to embrace headphones just to be able to listen to what I like to listen to.
And if you were kind of dozing off with the headphones on when time came across and the clocks started to clang, you would instantly wake up.
It was just amazing. And if you had, now, today, I got a set of Bose headphones and the JBLs, and I got some Vega speakers, some Serwin Vega speakers. So, we're spoiled now. But there was a time when just having stereo separation in two different ears was like, I feel like I'm a studio sound engineer here, right? Because it is so crisp. And then, the recording itself took advantage of that. It's almost like, they weren't sitting there with studio monitors. They were sitting there with headphones, and they knew that if they tweak a little bit on the left side, you hear it on the left side or on the right side. And that was pretty amazing.
And to be honest, the first, I think it was, the Beatles were the first to really exploit that. And then it was the Beach Boys with Brian Wilson, who really played around with that stereophonic effect. And,
right.
In Pet Sounds.
Right, and I get that, but I don't think that fans of those bands, certainly not the Beach Boys, listened with headphones. I mean, that was a Beach Boys music you'd blast in a car or something like that.
That's true.
But something like Pink Floyd, you listen to in headphones because it's like, that's how you had to hear it.
It was just headphone music, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. I got to cut it short, darn it. The clock says so. But what's the name of this film that's Buster Keaton to REM?
Yeah, it's called Sherlock Jr.
Sherlock Jr. Okay, I'm going to have to check that out as well. That sounds intriguing. Chris, thank you so much.
Oh, did it go so fast?
It did go so fast. I can't believe I'm looking. Oh, we got to bail out. So I will give you one opportunity to do it correctly.
Fade to black.
with a big pause. It's Rochester Today. Chris Miksanic, the MedCityMovieGuy.com on Newstalk 1340 KROC AM and 96.9